The Borg were supposed to be infinite, a civilization without limit, spreading through space like a glacier that could not melt. Every species absorbed became fuel for the next expansion. Every encounter proved that resistance was futile. The Federation watched them cross the galaxy, and the assumption settled in quickly. This was an empire that could not fail. Canon shows something else. What appears on screen is not a juggernaut ascending toward godhood. It is a system locked in place, repeating the same patterns across centuries, unable to move beyond the single mechanism that defines it. The Borg do not grow. They accumulate. And accumulation without transformation is not evolution. It is hoarding. The collective presents itself as the apex of efficiency, but efficiency optimized for one task becomes a trap when the environment changes. The Borg claim adaptability, but adaptation requires the capacity to recognize when the old solution no longer works. That capacity demands individuality, variance, and the freedom to fail. The Borg eliminated all three. Every recorded encounter with the collective reveals the same structural flaw. They assimilate, they do not innovate, they acquire technology, but they do not understand why it works. They replicate biological systems, but they cannot simulate the creativity that produced those systems in the first place. The pursuit of perfection became a rejection of the very processes that allow perfection to be approached. The Borg are not a threat because they are unstoppable. They are a threat because they cannot stop. And that difference is everything. The collective was designed to solve a problem. That much is clear from how it operates. Biological entropy, cultural fragmentation, resource competition, all the variables that destroy civilizations were stripped out and replaced with a single organizing principle. Unity through forced synthesis. One mind, one purpose, one trajectory, no dissent, no waste, no unpredictable divergence. On paper, it should work. A species that pools all knowledge and applies it without ego or delay should dominate any rival that still fractures along tribal or ideological lines. The flaw is that knowledge is not the same as understanding. The Borg absorb entire species and extract their technological achievements, but they do not absorb the process that led to those achievements. They take the result and skip the reasoning. A drone does not need to know why a warp coil functions in a specific configuration. It only needs to know that it does. That works when the environment is stable. When variables shift, when new problems arise that do not match archived solutions, the collective has no method for generating original responses. It can only search its database for the closest analog and apply it. This is not adaptation. This is pattern matching. And pattern matching fails the moment the pattern becomes unfamiliar. The first contact between the Federation and the Borg at System J 25 inches the year 2365 should have been a massacre. The Enterprise D was flung across the galaxy by an entity with motives no one understood, and what they found on the other side was a cube that moved through space like it owned it. No negotiation, no hesitation. The Borg cut into the ship's shields, adapted to phaser frequency within seconds, and began the process of cataloging the crew. 18 officers were assimilated before the Enterprise escaped. But escape was possible. A single maneuver, one desperate gamble involving a focused energy beam directed at a precise point on the cube's infrastructure, forced the Borg to pause long enough for Q to intervene. The encounter was brief, but it established a baseline. The Borg were powerful, but they were not omniscient. They adapted to known threats. They did not predict unknown tactics. That gap between reaction and anticipation would define every subsequent engagement. At Wolf 359, the collective demonstrated the cost of that gap in reverse. Starfleet knew the Borg were coming. They had months to prepare. 39 ships assembled to stop a single cube. Every captain in that fleet understood what they were facing. The Battle of Wolf 359 was not won by the Borg because they were invincible. It was won because Starfleet's doctrine was built for wars against rivals who thought like them. The Borg did not. They ignored formations, bypassed strategic strongpoints, and targeted ships in the order that maximized resource denial, not psychological impact. 11,000 people died because Starfleet tried to fight a conventional battle against an enemy that had no convention. Locutus was the key. Jean-Luc Picard, assimilated and converted into a spokesman for the collective, gave the Borg access to Starfleet's tactical database, command codes, and strategic philosophy. That should have been the end. One of the finest strategic minds in the Federation, stripped of autonomy and repurposed as a weapon, the cube reached Earth. It began cutting into the planet's defenses, and then it stopped. Not because the Borg were defeated in combat. They were defeated by an exploit. The Enterprise crew found a way to access the link between Locutus and the hive mind, introduced a command that forced the cube into a regeneration cycle, and used that 2-second window to destroy it from the inside. The collective had no defense against this tactic because it had never encountered it before. The hive mind is optimized for efficiency, not security. It assumes all connected nodes are loyal because disloyalty has been engineered out of existence. That assumption is correct until it is not. The Borg adapted after Wolf 359. They always adapt after. But adaptation in the collective's framework means adding a patch, not rethinking the system. The next time they encountered the Federation, their cubes had better shielding, rotating modulation frequencies, and redundant command pathways. What they did not have was a strategic model that accounted for enemies who could think faster than the archive could retrieve solutions. Every encounter with Starfleet followed the same rhythm. The Borg arrived, demonstrated overwhelming force, adapted to the first wave of resistance, and then faltered when the second wave introduced a variable they had not catalogued. The species designations tell the story. By the time Voyager encountered the collective in the Delta Quadrant, the Borg had catalogued thousands of species: Species 10026, Species 5618, Species 329. Each number represents a civilization that was absorbed, its people converted into drones, its knowledge archived, its ships dismantled for parts. That scale suggests dominance. But dominance is not the same as vitality. A parasite can dominate its host and still die when the host runs out. The Borg do not create, they harvest, and harvesting has a ceiling. The collective's inability to innovate becomes undeniable when examined across time. In 2063, a single Borg sphere traveled back in time to prevent Zefram Cochrane from launching humanity's first warp flight. The mission failed because a Starfleet crew followed them through the temporal wake and stopped the assimilation before it could propagate. But the mission itself reveals the desperation. The Borg, at some point in their future, decided that altering history was a viable strategy. That decision only makes sense if the present trajectory was failing. Time travel is not a tool of expansion. It is a tool of survival. A species that believes it is ascending does not gamble on paradox. The Borg went back because forward was no longer working, and the target was humanity, not the Vulcans, who had warp capability for centuries before first contact, not the Andorians, who fielded a battle-ready fleet while Earth was still using fusion reactors. Humanity, a species that should have been irrelevant in the grand scope of the galaxy. The Borg targeted humanity because humanity kept breaking the pattern. That is the tell. The collective does not fear strength. It catalogues strength and absorbs it. What it cannot process is creativity under pressure. Humanity, more than any other species the Borg encountered, refused to optimize for the expected outcome. Starfleet officers consistently disregarded their own survival in favor of improbable tactics. They destroyed their own ships to deny the enemy intelligence. They ignored chain of command when doctrine failed. They turned losses into intelligence that reshaped future engagements. That behavior does not scan as rational within the collective's framework. It scans as noise. And noise, in a system that depends on perfect signal clarity, is corrosive. The Queen is where the contradiction becomes structural. First observed in 2373, she claims to bring order to chaos. She describes herself as the one who gives the collective its voice, its identity, its focus. But her existence contradicts everything the Borg claim to be. A hive mind does not need a central authority. Centralization is a failure mode, not an optimization. The Queen is a patch, introduced because the distributed model was breaking down. She exists because the collective could no longer function without something that looked like leadership. But leadership requires decision-making. Decision-making requires prioritization. Prioritization requires values. And values are subjective. The Queen brings subjectivity into a system that was built to eliminate it. She makes the Borg more effective in the short term, but she also makes them fragile. Every time the Queen is destroyed, the collective falters, not because the drones stop functioning, but because the organizational logic collapses. A distributed intelligence should not depend on a single node. The fact that it does means the distribution was never as complete as the Borg believed. Voyager's journey through Borg space exposes the scale of that fragility. 7 of 9, a drone severed from the collective, retains her individuality even after years of reconditioning. Matrix 0, a mental sanctuary where drones experience autonomous thought during regeneration cycles, suggests that the suppression of individuality is not permanent. It is maintained through constant reinforcement. The moment that reinforcement stops, even for a few hours, the drones begin to diverge. Some remember who they were, some begin to question. A few even resist reassimilation. The collective spends enormous resources hunting down Unimatrix 0 participants and destroying the mental space they inhabit. That effort makes no sense if individuality is truly extinct. The Borg should not need to enforce conformity. Conformity should be the default state, hardwired into every drone at the moment of assimilation. The fact that enforcement is necessary means the process is incomplete. And if the process is incomplete, then every drone is a potential defector. The collective is not a unified consciousness. It is a forced consensus held together by constant suppression. That suppression has a cost. Species 8472 proved that cost in the most direct terms possible. Encountered in fluidic space, they were biologically and technologically incompatible with the Borg's assimilation framework. Their cellular structure resisted nanoprobe infection. Their bioships destroyed cubes in single volleys. The Borg could not adapt because there was no adaptation pathway. The usual method, assimilate a representative sample and reverse engineer the biology, did not work. Species 8472 could not be assimilated. And if they could not be assimilated, the collective had no strategy. The Borg made contact with Voyager and proposed an alliance. Not because they valued cooperation, but because they were losing. That negotiation, that moment of reaching out to a lesser species for help, should never have happened. The collective is built on the assumption that it is always the superior force. It does not ask for help. It demands compliance. The species 8472 conflict shattered that assumption. For the first time in recorded history, the Borg encountered a problem they could not solve alone. Voyager provided the solution. A nanoprobe-based weapon that could penetrate species 8472's biological defenses. The collective used it to force a stalemate, and species 8472 withdrew to fluidic space. The war ended. But the underlying truth remained. The Borg had been saved by a species they considered beneath notice. And that species, Voyager's crew, extracted concessions in exchange. Safe passage through Borg space. The return of 7 of 9. The collective agreed because it had no alternative. That is not the behavior of a dominant power. That is the behavior of a system under strain. The pattern repeats across every major engagement. The Borg arrive, demonstrate overwhelming force, and then lose ground the moment the enemy introduces a novel tactic. At the Battle of Sector 1-inch 2373, a second cube penetrated Federation space and again targeted Earth. The fleet that assembled to stop it was larger than Wolf 359, better coordinated, and equipped with rotating shield frequencies designed to counter Borg adaptation. The cube still carved through the line. It reached Earth. It began assimilating the surface, and then the Enterprise E, arriving late to the battle, fired on a seemingly random point on the cube's hull. That single volley triggered a cascade failure that destroyed the entire ship. Picard, still carrying fragmented memories of his time as Locutus, identified a structural weakness that no other captain had noticed. The Borg had adapted their shields, their weapons, and their regeneration protocols. They had not reinforced the weak points that Starfleet had already exploited. The archive told them what had failed before. It did not tell them how to prevent the same failure in a new context. That oversight is not an accident. It is a design flaw. The collective optimizes for known threats and ignores improbable ones. Improbable threats are filtered out as statistical noise. But in warfare, the improbable is what wins. A species that cannot account for the improbable will always be vulnerable to the enemy that embraces it. The Borg's territorial behavior supports this reading. They do not conquer in the way organic empires do. They do not occupy planets, establish governance, or convert populations over time. They harvest and move on. The areas they designate as Borg space are not controlled in any meaningful sense. They are transit corridors where cubes travel between harvest zones. Other species pass through Borg space regularly as long as they do not provoke attention. The collective does not care about dominance for its own sake. They care about acquisition, and acquisition without integration is just accumulation. A species that accumulates without integrating is not building an empire. It is building a junkyard. The Borg's technological stagnation is visible in their ships. The cube is a marvel of engineering, modular, redundant, nearly indestructible. But it is also the only design the collective uses at scale. Spheres exist for specialized roles. The rare Diamond-class ships appear in specific contexts, but the vast majority of the fleet is cubes. Identical cubes, built to the same template with the same capabilities. A species that assimilates thousands of civilizations should have a fleet as diverse as the galaxies they harvest. Instead, they fly the same ship over and over for centuries. That uniformity is a choice. The collective prioritizes efficiency, and efficiency in their framework means reducing variance. A single ship class is easier to maintain, easier to replicate, easier to integrate into the hive's logistical model. But that choice assumes the environment will remain stable. Ship design is a response to tactical pressures. If those pressures change and your fleet does not, you lose. The Borg maintain the same ship class because they do not believe the environment will change. They believe they control the environment. They do not. The collective's treatment of drones reinforces the same limitation. Every assimilated individual is stripped of identity, repurposed as a processing node, and assigned a function based on their biological and technological distinctiveness. That model works if the goal is efficiency. It fails if the goal is resilience. A system where every node is interchangeable has no specialization. And without specialization, you cannot develop expertise. The Borg have knowledge, but knowledge without context is just data. Data does not solve novel problems. People do. 7 of 9's reintegration into human society demonstrates what the collective discards. Her skills as an engineer, her tactical instincts, and her capacity for independent analysis all stem from her individuality. The Borg suppressed those traits because they introduced variance. But variance is what allowed her to solve problems that stumped the rest of Voyager's crew. She thought differently, and thinking differently is the only way to approach a problem that has never been solved before. The collective cannot afford that variance. It would destabilize the hive. But without it, the hive cannot evolve. The system is static by design, and static systems do not survive contact with dynamic environments. The turning point is not a single event. It is a recognition that the Borg are not expanding anymore. they are contracting. Species 8472 forced them into a stalemate. The Federation learned to counter their adaptation cycles. The Alpha Quadrant powers began coordinating their defenses, sharing intelligence, and developing weapons specifically designed to exploit Borg weaknesses. The collective's influence in the Delta Quadrant remains vast, but it is no longer growing. They still assimilate ships, harvest planets, and add to the archive, but the rate of expansion has slowed. That slowdown is invisible from inside the hive. The collective does not measure success in terms of growth rate, it measures success in terms of acquisition. As long as they are still adding to the archive, the mission continues. But acquisition without acceleration is stagnation. A species that is not accelerating is falling behind. And the Borg, for all their accumulated knowledge, are falling behind. The Queen understands this. That is why she pursues humanity so aggressively. Not because humanity is powerful, but because humanity represents something the collective cannot synthesize. The capacity to adapt without consensus, to innovate without certainty, to sacrifice efficiency in favor of survival. Every encounter with the Federation has taught the Borg that their model is incomplete, and the Queen's response is not to change the model, it is to eliminate the example. That is not strategy, that is fear. The Delta Quadrant holds evidence of older Borg failures. Wrecked cubes drift in dead systems, their power cores offline, their drones inactive. Some were destroyed in combat. Others simply stopped functioning, victims of cascading system failures that the collective could not repair in time. Voyager encountered several of these derelicts. None of them were scavenged. The Borg left them where they fell. A species that prioritizes efficiency should strip every derelict for parts. The fact that they do not suggests the derelicts are too damaged to be useful, or the effort required to salvage them exceeds their value. Either reading implies the same thing. The collective is reaching the limits of its resource model. Assimilation costs energy, time, and infrastructure. If the return on that investment diminishes, the system becomes unsustainable. And the evidence suggests the return is diminishing. The species the Borg encounter now are less advanced than the species they assimilated centuries ago. The technological leaps are smaller, the archive grows, but the value of each addition decreases. The Borg are strip mining a depleted vein, and they do not know how to stop. Their inability to innovate extends to their strategic thinking. Every major Borg operation follows the same structure. Identify the target, send a cube, assimilate or destroy. If the cube fails, send another. There is no subtlety, no misdirection, no long-term planning beyond resource acquisition. A human fleet would feint, divide, and strike from an unexpected angle. The Borg do not feint. They do not believe they need to. And that belief costs them. At the Battle of Sector 001, the cube could have bypassed Earth entirely, struck at a less defended core world, and forced Starfleet to divide its forces. Instead, it targeted Earth directly, the most heavily defended planet in the Federation. That choice makes sense if the goal is psychological impact. It makes no sense if the goal is efficiency. The Borg claim to optimize for efficiency, but their behavior suggests they optimize for dominance displays. Dominance displays are about perception, and perception is subjective. The collective is not as objective as it claims. Their use of temporal tactics exposes another failure point. Time travel is catastrophically dangerous. Altering the past can erase the present, create paradoxes, or destabilize causality itself. The Borg's decision to send a sphere back to 2063 suggests they believed the risk was worth it. That belief only makes sense if the present was already unstable. A species confident in its trajectory does not gamble on time. The fact that they did gamble, and that the gamble failed, suggests the future they came from was worse than the past they tried to prevent. That future is instructive. The Borg of the 29th century, if that is when the sphere originated, had access to temporal technology advanced enough to punch through a spatial anomaly and target a specific date. They should have been gods. Instead, they were desperate enough to risk everything on a single strike at humanity's origin point. That desperation implies failure. Not just a tactical failure, an existential one. The Borg were not trying to conquer the Federation. They were trying to erase the variable that kept breaking their model. And even that failed. Species like the Kazon, the Talaxians, and the Vidians pass through the Delta Quadrant without Borg interference. They are not targeted for assimilation because they lack technological distinctiveness. The collective has already catalogued their capabilities and deemed them irrelevant. That filtering process makes sense in the short term. Why waste resources on low-value targets? But in the long term, it creates blind spots. A species dismissed as irrelevant today may develop something unique tomorrow. The Borg will not notice until it is too late because they stopped paying attention. That is the cost of optimization. You become blind to everything outside the optimized parameters. The collective's decline is not sudden. It is gradual, almost invisible from any single vantage point. But across the span of recorded encounters, the trajectory is clear. The Borg are less effective in 2378 than they were in 2365. They have not grown weaker in absolute terms. Their cubes are still devastating, their drones are still lethal, but their enemies have grown faster. Starfleet develops new weapons, new tactics, and new alliances every year. The Borg develop nothing. They acquire, they adapt, and they stagnate. And stagnation in a competitive environment is the same as regression. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. The Borg claim to have transcended individuality, but their behavior suggests something else. The pursuit of perfection is a value judgment. Perfection implies a goal state, an ideal to strive toward. But ideals are subjective. Different species define perfection differently. The Borg's definition, unity through forced synthesis, reflects a specific fear. The fear of chaos, the fear of disorder, the fear of being wrong. A species that has transcended fear does not need to assimilate everything it encounters. It would have the confidence to coexist. The Borg do not coexist. They absorb, and that absorption is compulsive, not strategic. They cannot stop because stopping would mean admitting the process is complete. And if the process is complete, then there is no purpose left. The collective exists to pursue perfection. If perfection is achieved, the collective has no reason to exist. So perfection must remain forever out of reach. That is the trap. The Borg cannot succeed without rendering themselves obsolete, and they cannot fail without disintegrating. The only stable state is the one they are in now, perpetual pursuit of an unreachable goal, expanding just enough to justify their existence, but never growing fast enough to outpace their limitations. They are not a civilization, they are a mechanism, and mechanisms do not evolve. They wear out. The encounters with the Enterprise D, the Enterprise E, and Voyager all end the same way. The Borg are defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior creativity. Starfleet officers, often acting alone or in small teams, find exploits that the collective's archive did not predict. Those exploits work because they rely on lateral thinking, risk tolerance, and the willingness to sacrifice protocol in favor of survival. The Borg cannot replicate that process because replication requires understanding, and understanding requires the freedom to be wrong. The collective does not permit failure. Every action is calculated, every decision is optimized, every outcome is archived. That model eliminates waste, but it also eliminates experimentation. And without experimentation, there is no innovation. The Borg have a billion solutions to problems they have already solved. They have no method for generating solutions to problems they have never seen. That is why they lose. The final piece is the Queen's obsession with 7 of 9. After her separation from the collective, the Queen pursues her relentlessly. Not to reclaim her as a drone, but to convince her to return voluntarily. That pursuit makes no sense within the collective's framework. 7 is a single individual, insignificant in the scale of the hive. Her loss should not register. But the Queen sees her as proof that the collective is incomplete. 7 chose individuality. That choice, that rejection of unity, threatens the foundation of everything the Borg claim to be. If one drone can leave and thrive, others might follow. And if others follow, the collective collapses. The Queen's reaction is not about 7, it is about the system. The hive cannot tolerate proof that individuality is viable. That proof undermines the justification for forced assimilation. It suggests that unity is not the only path to strength. And if unity is not the only path, then the suffering the Borg inflict, the civilizations they erase, the lives they destroy, all of it becomes unjustifiable. The collective cannot afford that doubt. So the Queen pursues 7, not out of strategy, but out of existential necessity. And she fails, every time. The Borg's treatment of the Alpha Quadrant reveals the same pattern. They send 2 cubes in 30 years, 2. For a civilization that spans half the galaxy and commands thousands of ships, that is not an invasion, it is a probe. They test the Federation's defenses, catalog the response, and withdraw. A true assault would involve dozens of cubes, striking multiple core worlds simultaneously, overwhelming Starfleet's ability to coordinate a defense. The Borg have the resources for that assault. They choose not to deploy them. That restraint is telling. The collective does not commit to total war because total war is risky. If they deploy a full fleet and lose, the archive will record that loss as a failure of the model. As long as they send isolated cubes, each defeat can be rationalized as insufficient data. The system is never wrong. The application was incomplete. That rationalization protects the collective's self-image, but it also prevents them from ever committing fully to a conquest. They probe, they test, and they retreat. That is not the behavior of an apex predator. It is the behavior of a species that knows, somewhere deep in the architecture of the hive, that it cannot win. The long-term projections are grim. The Borg assimilate at a fixed rate. Their enemies adapt at an accelerating rate. Starfleet, the Klingons, the Romulans, even the Kazon, all of them learn from every encounter. They share intelligence, develop countermeasures, and refine their tactics. The Borg do not. They add to the archive and repeat the same strategies. The gap closes every year. Eventually, it inverts. When that happens, the collective will face a choice: adapt or collapse. And adaptation, real adaptation, requires dismantling the hive itself. It requires reintroducing individuality, variance, and the freedom to fail. The Borg cannot do that without ceasing to be Borg, so they will not adapt. They will collapse. The tragedy is not that they are evil. Evil implies agency, choice, intent. The Borg have none of those. They are a system executing its programming. The tragedy is that the programming is terminal. It cannot self-correct. It cannot recognize its own failure. It can only continue until it stops. And it will stop. The Federation's encounters with the collective are framed as existential threats. The Borg are coming. Resistance is futile. Prepare for assimilation. That framing is accurate in the moment. A single cube is a catastrophic threat to any planet it targets. But across the span of history, the threat diminishes. The first cube at Wolf 359 killed 11,000 people and was stopped by a desperate exploit. The second cube at Sector 001 was stopped by a coordinated fleet and another exploit. The sphere that traveled through time was stopped by a single ship. Each encounter ends the same way. The Borg lose. Not because they are weak, because they are predictable. And predictability, in warfare, is fatal. The collective's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. Unity eliminates internal conflict, but it also eliminates internal diversity. A hive mind can coordinate billions of drones with perfect efficiency, but it cannot generate original thought. It can only execute the thoughts already archived. That model works in a static universe. The universe is not static. It is dynamic, chaotic, and fundamentally unpredictable. A species optimized for static conditions will always fail when those conditions change. The Borg optimized for a universe that no longer exists. The end state is not a dramatic collapse. It is a slow grinding down. Fewer cubes launched each decade. Fewer species assimilated. More resources spent defending existing territory rather than expanding. The archive keeps growing, but the growth slows. The hive persists, but the persistence becomes maintenance rather than conquest. Eventually, the collective reaches equilibrium. No longer expanding, no longer adapting, no longer relevant. They do not disappear. They become a curiosity, a relic of a time when forced unity seemed like the answer. Other species will study them, avoid them, and move on. The Borg will continue to exist, drifting through space, assimilating the occasional unlucky ship, but never again threatening the balance of the galaxy. They will become what they were always becoming: a dead end, a warning, a monument to the idea that perfection, pursued without wisdom, is just another word for extinction. The official story says the Borg are an unstoppable force, a nightmare that cannot be reasoned with or defeated. The canon suggests something sadder: a civilization that mistook accumulation for growth, control for strength, and uniformity for perfection. They built a machine that cannot stop, cannot learn, and cannot see that it is already dying, not because they were destroyed by an external force, but because the system they created was always going to eat itself. The Borg are not perfect. They are finite. And finite systems, no matter how vast, no matter how ancient, always end the same way. They run out,